Condemned: Criminal Origins released on November 22nd, 2005. It was developed by Monolith Productions, who at the time were known for Fear and The Matrix Online. The game released as a launch title for the Xbox 360 and was influenced by movies like Silence of the Lambs as well as Seven. And for their latest game, designers wanted to create a game around either a new mechanic or one with a twist, and decided to implement a melee combat system that allowed the players to get up close and personal with the game's horrors. Banned in Germany due to its brutality and releasing exclusively on a console that at the time wasn't yet known for its vast library of games, the brawling simulator only managed to sell around 500,000 copies worldwide. But even with such low sales, it has since become a cult classic that manages to spook people still to this day. And aside from being one of the only games in existence capable of making an orchard truly terrifying, it also features one of the most infamous levels in horror game history. And although the game was made by the same studio that created Fear, it certainly doesn't need to rely on ladders in order to terrify you. And with horror games being back in style, I think it's time to go back and play this underrated cult classic, because this game is kind of insane. Now, one of the things that makes Condemned great is that it doesn't follow typical horror game design. It's not a walking simulator, the combat isn't purposely dumbed down and clunky, and it's not filled with unnecessary jump scares, even though it features one of gaming's most iconic ones. The game follows crime scene investigator Ethan Thomas.
Thomas, I don't got all day here. Let's get a move on.
Sent to a crime scene along with two fellow police officers in order to investigate a murder that has happened in a grimy downtown area in a fictional city loosely based on Seattle called Metro. A young woman has been strangled and posed beside a mannequin and appears to be the latest victim of a serial killer called the Matchmaker. And in usual horror game fashion, it doesn't take long before things take a turn for the worse, as it turns out that the killer is still inside the building and cuts the lights, and after splitting up in order to find them, Ethan goes to restore the power, and after a brief stint as Electro, the killer manages to get a hold of his gun in a cutscene that sets the mood for the rest of the game. And after finally catching up to him, Ethan gets into a scuffle and the two police officers, whose reaction times clearly indicate that they are well past retirement age, try and save him, but they end up being shot and Ethan gets thrown out of the building. Sometime later, he wakes up in his apartment where he is greeted by a mysterious man called Malcolm Van Horn, who informs him that the FBI are out to get him, as he's the prime suspect in the murder of his two fellow police officers, which were not only killed using his gun, it also appears that Ethan tried to flee the scene. Not everyone believes in Ethan's guilt though, and forensics analyst Rosa Angel helps Ethan along his way by analyzing scraps of suspicious fluid he scraped off the sidewalk in shady back alleys during his desperate journey to clear his name. Condemned actually had a pretty interesting development cycle. You see, it released only a month after Fear, and while Monolith Productions are known today for their Middle-earth series, Monolith has actually touched on several genres, with games like Alien vs Predator 2, No One Lives Forever 2, and The Matrix Online, a franchise which played a heavy influence on Fear, because although it is a horror game, it was very action-focused and featured slow-mo elements inspired by the Matrix movies. Their unique approach to the game cemented Monolith as a premier horror game developer, and for their follow-up game, they opted to lean more into the supernatural, with a protagonist that could use psychic powers and focused more on melee combat rather than first-person shooting. They would even showcase a prototype of this game simply called The Dark. However, by the time the game released, the game would drop a lot of the shown features and would focus on a novel approach for the game. Now, what I love about Condemned is just how straightforward it is. There are no confusing puzzles or backtracking, no elaborate enemies or villains to best in convoluted boss fights. It's just you, a 2x4, and a town full of crazies. The game feels sort of like a mix of Resident Evil 7 and Outlast, with a dash of Phasmophobia, only set in a dark and gritty city with a heavy focus on being up close and personal with your enemies. And you never really feel that overpowered or in control of the situation. And I think the best word to describe the combat in Condemned is
perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Because this is the kind of game where you'll be fighting two guys, and after getting one of them down, you'll be asking yourself where the hell the other guy went, just before you get knocked out by a third opponent that you didn't even see coming. And this frantic style of combat is made possible due to the thing that Monolith does best, namely AI. Because in Condemned, the AI can hide, flee, retreat, and look to ambush you or run off to grab a weapon, and tense moments just seem to come about naturally, and the player can never be quite sure where everyone is, but you can be damn sure that they can hear you. It's one of those games where it feels like enemies can just come at you from any angle. I mean, they'll even just run off mid-combat in order to grab a weapon, which consists of tearing pipes and planks off the walls, and then they'll just start swinging wildly at both you and the other poor schmucks stuck in there with you, which makes it feel even more like you can never be sure just what to expect. And even though you play as a crime scene investigator, don't be fooled, because this game requires surprisingly little brain power compared to other old horror games, and that's not a detriment to the game at all. Rather, I want to lift it up as a positive for new players. The investigative parts of this game basically amount to getting into the correct position and then pressing a button to magically bring out whatever tool is needed for the occasion. And while they definitely could have expanded the feature, it never really gets in the way and makes picking up the game just that much simpler. Now, although the sequel did introduce a deeper combat system, in this game, designers purposely didn't want to add too much depth in order to keep the game loop simple yet effective. You can melee, dodge, shoot a firearm and run away, and that's pretty much what you're gonna be doing for the entire game. However, combined with an animation system that makes attacks feel weighty, and an audio design that is dark and oppressive, it really does feel like people are getting hit with heavy objects, and makes the combat feel really satisfying. And this is the kind of game where it's not always beneficial to grab a weapon, since it will only have the amount of ammo that was left in it when it was dropped by an enemy, and if it's used up, you'll now basically have a worse melee weapon than say an axe or a lead pipe. Most gunfights are over pretty quickly, however, as both you and the enemy take a lot of damage when shooting. The rare fights that are prolonged though can lead to some pretty tense moments. A lot of the times it might be best to not even try and grab their gun and just bait out shots and then go after them. There's also the taser that will stun lock enemies, allowing you to have your way with them, and if all else fails, you can still sprint away from your enemies. Now, I kind of just want to bring up a pet peeve of mine here, as a first-person perspective for horror games have always been a mixed bag for me, because if you think about it, why would you use a first-person camera for a game to begin with? You know, aside from saving time and money on animating yet another character. Well, it adds to the immersion, which is obviously a good thing for horror games, because it makes it feel like you are the character that horrible things are happening to. But there's another important reason to choose an FPS camera, and that is because you want aiming to be fast and precise, and you also don't want camera movements to be tied to animations, so you can pull off fast 360 no-scopes. This, however, I feel clashes with horror games because their perspective is so well suited for fast and fluid movement that the only way for developers to make you feel less powerful is to slow you down and make you turn slower and make the gunplay feel clunky and aiming imprecise in an attempt to make you feel weak and underpowered. And I've never really found this solution that appealing, which is why I prefer a third-person perspective, because at least you get a visual feedback as to why you are so slow and clunky. Like, you can sort of just get a better feel for why you aren't great at combat when you can clearly see that you're just a normal person in a bad situation. So basically, the added immersion is almost always dragged down by worse gunplay. However, I think Condemned is one of the few examples that works, because having it being a third-person game and knowing what's behind you would make the game feel a lot less claustrophobic. There are also no borderline Devil May Cry type bosses that really shows the faults in such a design, which is a good thing. And even by today's standards, the combat in Condemned is essentially a dance where you dodge and weave your way through enemies, all while they're beating up not only you, but each other, and it all just works, well, for the most part. Now, when it comes to the level design in Condemned, it's actually pretty basic. There isn't any backtracking like you'd expect from a typical survival horror title, where you fetch and combine key items in order to progress to new areas. However, with its many corridors and doors, the game does a good job of making you feel like you're in a maze, even though it's very linear in scope. The only thing that really stops you along the way are doors or locks, where you need either a fire axe, a sledgehammer or shovel to get through, which is kind of strange as I don't really see why a sledgehammer wouldn't work as well as an axe at taking breaking down a door, but hey. The standout level of the game is of course the department store, because at this point in the game Ethan has already had several hallucinations and it's getting harder to tell what is real or not. And then as you're wandering around the store, all of a sudden the mannequins start to move. And there are no camera zooms forcing you to focus on them, going, look at me, isn't this scary? They just start walking around, and it's entirely possible to miss them doing it. And another cool thing is that, at this point, Ethan is also being cornered by the police, adding to the tension. And I don't know about you, but if I had the choice between being captured by the police and being chased by mannequins, I'd jump headfirst through that barricade faster than the Flash can get flashed by the Reverse Flash. If you're interested in playing this game, do it for this level alone. And while a lot of survival horror games lean heavily on action towards the end of the game, and Condemned certainly does this too, it still manages to retain the scare factor, as later on you enter a farmhouse where you walk around with your UV light out, while having to constantly deal with enemies stalking you in the shadows, as you try and piece together clues as to what's going on. And going down to the basement here is again one of the standout moments of the game. There are also several collectibles like TV sets, birds and metal plates, and while they certainly gave early 360 gamers easy gamer scores, nowadays they're pretty pointless as they don't add anything to the story. Although graphically it might not look like much by today's standards, when the game released in 2005, it was really pushing the capabilities of the console's hardware, with dynamic lighting and shadows that hold up surprisingly well for a launch title for the Xbox 360. The game looks dark, gritty and atmospheric, and it's one of the few good horror games set in my personal favorite horror setting, a city. A dark and dirty city where things have gone wrong and you're on your own trying to survive its madness. And in Condemned, the only real bit of world building we get is in the beginning of the game, where we are told that crime and violence is on the rise. The rest is told through the art direction, and the game also does an excellent job of preying on familiar fears. Ever been the last person in office before closing? Ever stood in a subway at night in a bad area? Condemned does all of this. And what's so great about it is that unlike other games, there aren't piles of bodies and gore everywhere, or strange substances down in dark sewers. In fact, the only odd things that you'll come across are some mysterious scribblings on the wall, which could mean something, or they could not. But for the most part, it's just you running around in empty buildings at night, while violent addicts are out to get you, and it's just fun. Now granted, some voice lines are a bit rough, like when Ethan comes across a body that turns out to be himself and he reacts like this.
Thomas speaking.
But then the game makes up for it with moments like this, when I got wrecked by one of the best jump scares I've seen in a long time. The sound design in this game also really helps to elevate the game's atmosphere and make it one of the only games apart from Dead Space to make trains sound truly terrifying. Like, the audio team really nailed the feeling of being alone in the city at night, and it has some of the best ambience in any horror game. Like, every time you walk into a new location, you always get the feel that something bad is just around the corner. Like, the game really has a way of making you feel like you're truly on your own and far away from any help. Even when on the phone with Rosa and you're essentially as safe as you can be since it's a story cutscene, there's still an unnerving atmosphere to everything. Even the last level feels less like a heroic triumph and more like a last-ditch effort at ending whatever evil it is that we're facing. The plot of Condemned is pretty good, all things considered. We follow CSU agent Ethan Thomas arriving in a rundown building where he's supposed to aid the local police in an investigation of a recent murder. Things quickly take a turn for the worse, however, and the two policemen are killed with Ethan's very own pistol, making Ethan the prime suspect in a murder case, and he has to go on a run from the law while being aided by a mysterious man named Malcolm Van Horn, as well as his colleague Rosa Angel. Van Horn in particular seems to know a lot more than he lets on. For example, he lets Ethan know that he has special powers and wants him to trust his instincts, and whatever powers he has seem to manifest themselves in part as seeing visions of past events, which, along with Rosa and his tools, help him piece together what is going on. And the game is essentially a tense game of cat and mouse, where we are always one step behind the killer and just shy of being caught by the police. And as the game progresses, we learn that the guy we're after character is actually a serial killer that is out killing serial killers, and he's a sort of alpha serial killer called Serial Killer X, and his preferred method is to toy with his victims, using their own methods against them until they break, making him not have to deliver the final blow himself. And the investigations that follow and seeing what SKX is doing to these people is actually one of the highlights of the game, and it just makes me wish that there were more CSI type games like this. And as the game progresses, the visions become more tangible and Ethan will see objects seemingly moving around on their own. Van Horn also makes it pretty apparent that he is stalking Ethan, at one point appearing seemingly out of nowhere as Ethan is about to enter a school, and while we do learn that he knew Ethan's dad, it's left unclear whether or not we can actually trust him. Eventually though, Ethan learns why Van Horn has taken such a special interest in him, as Rosa reveals that the Bureau has been keeping a file on Ethan and his special powers. And it's at this point that the game starts to lean more and more into supernatural elements and cranks up the scare factor. Ethan does eventually catch up to Serial Killer X at a farmhouse, where he's already claimed his latest victim, and in a stroke of genius, Ethan decides to pose as the body of his latest victim in order to try and get the drop on him. You know, instead of just waiting for him and shooting him with a gun, whacking him with a sledgehammer, or you know, just sucker punching him. His plan of course backfires, and a cat and mouse style boss fight ensues where Ethan gets knocked out. He's then taken to an orchard where some sort of 80s movie inspired creature is revealed to have been the one causing everyone to go insane. And while I know that this level gets a lot of flack, I actually thought it was one of the more intense and scary levels of the game, as something just feels off during the entire run of it. We also face this creature several times before finally taking him on in one last boss fight where Ethan frees himself of his nightmares. And so ends Condemned Criminal Origins, with Ethan being cleared of the murders but still being closely watched by the FBI. And after saying farewell to Rosa, we get to one of the most controversial jump scare endings in horror game history. Mysteries lose their appeal the instant that you explain them. But whether you think the ending to Condemned is bad or not, I still feel like it works. It's a memorable game with fun gameplay and a good plot, which is all we can really ask for in the end. And considering how the second game ended, having a few weird twists and turns might actually not have been that bad. And if we ever do get a Condemned 3 or a remake of the first one, I think the best way to move forward is to combine this game's tone and atmosphere with the combat system of the second game, and it should be an instant classic. Because Condemned is a unique beast among its peers. It is a murder mystery, paranormal horror thriller game where you're on the run from the police and you spend your nights fighting hobos and getting spooky visions about spooky things. But what do you guys think? Should Condemned be remade? Leave a comment with your thoughts below, and as always, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.